great pleasure to introduce Paul Thompson, who is Kellogg Professor at Michigan State University. Paul is author of numerous books, and I will mention just a few of them. Food Biotechnology and Ethical Perspective is surely the most comprehensive treatment of one of the issues that is the focus of one of our courses in food biotechnology. His book, The Spirit of the Soil, is one that I heartily recommend to all of you, and it's going to be one of the core texts in a sustainable agriculture course that I'll be teaching in fall. So I admire it tremendously, and I think it's one of the best reads in environmental and agricultural ethics. My personal favorite is one that is not read as much as some of the others, but The Ethics of Aid and Trade is still incredibly relevant, and in fact I think more relevant now than it was when it came out. Paul has written, well, as Dane mentioned, Paul writes papers more quickly than most of us can read them, and he is an excellent philosopher who writes on crucial issues in a manner that makes them wonderfully accessible and clear. I think of him as the person who really invented the field of agricultural ethics and agriculture and environmental ethics. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce him to you, Paul Thompson.
Thank you. Well, there's absolutely no way I can live up to an introduction like that. This is a wonderful place to sit and do a little philosophy. A number of years ago got kind of irritated with the idea that what I was doing kept being called applied philosophy. I'm not applying anything. I'm just kind of like most philosophers. We just kind of make it up as we go along. And there's nothing I'm applying here. And most of my friends are fairly happy being called practical philosophers, but I'm not really all that practical either. So I've decided that what I prefer is occasional philosophy. And my friends say that fits me well because what I do is only occasionally philosophy. But what it comes from is a term in poetry where an occasional poem is a poem that's done for a special occasion, right? So what kind of philosophy could we do for this kind of an occasion? I've been really struggling with this. When Dane contacted me way back, maybe it was March or something like that, but turned in this title of Placing Place, I was kind of struggling with an issue of really trying to understand what was going on in some of the literature on place, and so I made up this title and thought I'd talk about that. Now that I get here today, I'll say a little bit about it, but it doesn't really actually seem to fit, so I've been thinking that maybe what I would do is shift over and talk about food, right? We're on this wonderful farm, and we've all just eaten a wonderful meal, and maybe we could relate some ideas about food to an occasion such as this. And as I've just been sitting here, I've been thinking, well, gosh, how do these things fit together? And I took a little heart from a recent paper by Mark Sagoff. Some of you who are in this Institute program heard Sagoff's work described yesterday, but Mark has a brand new paper which he starts up by quoting F. Scott Fitzgerald, who I apparently said the mark of a great intellectual is to keep two contradictory ideas in mind at the same time and still function. So, we're going to see how intellectual we can really be tonight. We're going to juxtapose two things that may not have that much to do with one another. This stuff on place, I was kind of irritated by a PhD student. I was on the committee, a wonderful student. I wasn't irritated by her, but she was doing some work on sense of place and the way that it would contribute to natural resource management. And she was diving into this literature, and through working with her on her dissertation, I was just an outside member, but I discovered that there's, maybe 50 papers published in the last decade on the notion of place. And this stuff is mostly approaches the idea of place by going around and surveying people and asking them, what it is about places that makes them valuable or memorable to you. And this stuff is, it's fine as far as it goes, and the kind of answers that they get are probably what you would expect. People find places memorable because they've spent time at those places with people that they love, with family members. And so there starts to get this notion in the literature that what's really important about what's important about places is not really the place itself, but it's the people that you're around. And other people talk about kind of spiritual experiences and feeling inspired when they're out in nature, and that sort of starts to suggest in the literature that what place is important for is generating this certain sort of affective reaction on the part of people. That's all fine as far as it goes, but I kept thinking, well, there's something about place itself that is really missing from this literature. And that's what got me off on this how agrarian philosophy might help theme. And I'll say a little bit about this, but I don't want you to think too hard about it. I'm not sure it makes any sense at all. But just to get you some orientation to what I mean by agrarian philosophy, I'm thinking about a number of ideas that have held sway at various times in history that associate the formation of character, and not just individual character, not just moral character of individuals, but also of communities, with the practices that they engage in at the places that they live. So perhaps the most famous agrarian rhetoric comes from Thomas Jefferson, who says that farmers are the most valuable citizens, and calls them the people of God, but he also adds, if God ever had a people, because in whose breast there would be no deposit of sin or whatever. Why does Jefferson say this? I mean, is it because he thinks farmers are somehow truly noble, moral people? The thing that you got to remember at Jefferson is that he was a farmer, and Jefferson has a lot of papers where he actually describes his relations with the other farmers that had land adjoining his. And if you get into some of that literature, which I have, you discover that most of the farmers that Jefferson had intimate dealings with were actually pretty scurrilous scumbags who were constantly trying to get onto his property and do things that he really didn't approve of. So, this idea that somehow farming makes you a virtuous person in the broad sense doesn't square with most of what Jefferson actually wrote, albeit not for public consumption, about farming. What Jefferson actually had in mind was a fairly specific kind of political situation which he faced, which was can be articulated actually by a debate that he was having with Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was proposing that we have a brand new nation. This is taking place in the administrations of Washington and Adams, and we've got to get this country off the ground and get it going. And Hamilton's proposal was, let's take all the resources that we have nationally and build factories in New Jersey. That way we'll get the ability to spark our economic growth, and we'll be able to compete with the Europeans, and this is what's going to give us jobs. It's what's going to get us going. Actually, very familiar kind of talk from a politician. And Jefferson's praise of farmers was actually being stated in direct response to Hamilton's proposal for spending money on an industrial center in New Jersey. His view was that it made much more sense as a development strategy to invest in agriculture. And when he got to be president, he had the opportunity to do that, and he took all the money that Hamilton wanted to spend. Of course, Hamilton was dead by this time. Aaron Burr had shot him. Aaron Burr, as you recall, was the other vice president who shot somebody. But what Jefferson spent all the money on was the Louisiana Purchase, which eventually became the basis for the Homestead Act and for extensive agricultural settlement of the United States. Jefferson's rationale for this was that what you needed was people whose livelihood, the way in which they derived their living was tied to the land. And the reason for that was not that land somehow made you a better person, it was that it made you a better citizen. And he was thinking specifically of the way in which, if you have invested your life in your land and put in the kind of improvements that we see all around us, that you have a commitment to the land that's going to tie you to that particular place. Jefferson had, in the course of fighting the Revolutionary War, seen a lot of people whose wealth was tied up in trade and in manufacturing pull up stakes and leave. He didn't see any farmers pull up stakes and leave because all of their wealth was tied to the land. So his idea was that at this particular time in the history of the United States, when it was really critical to develop a sense of citizenship and a sense of loyalty to the country, it was really critical to have an economic development plan that was going to tie people's wealth to a non-movable asset, to a permanent asset that would mean that they would continue to stay there and work through the various kinds of problems that the country was going to face and would not pick up and leave and go off to some other colony or move to Canada or whatever. So he had an agrarian view. Farming produces citizenship, but it was an agrarian view that was actually fairly specifically tied to a time and place and situation. Another president who promoted agrarian views was Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt's views were that as people were, as the U.S. was becoming increasingly organized around cities and factory industrial centers, that it was now important to provide a time in people's lives when they would actually have an experience that would be of nature. And he thought that this was going to be critical for developing decisive character habits, for being able to act quickly, being able to be independent, be able to make decisions on their own. And he came to this decision because he grew up in suburban New York, and as a young man came out west, I believe to Montana, although he was pretty much all over the West, and operated a cattle ranch. And if you believe his word, which is a little hard to believe when you read some of his works, was quite a figure on a horse, had blind as a bat, but basically learned to rope and ride and do the ranching work, and that these were the character traits that were most important for him when he went back and became a political leader, first as governor of New York and then eventually as president. Roosevelt's political action was to create the national park system and the wilderness, not the Wilderness Act, but to begin to start to set up this idea that federal lands need to be set aside so that people would continue to be able to have these kinds of experiences. And he felt that this was something that was going to be really critical for people most of whose lives was going to be spent in urban pursuits and in business, that this was going to be a critical kind of character building view. In some respects, Roosevelt's view is probably closer to what many people think Jefferson's view was. I mean, Jefferson didn't have a very romantic view of being outdoors and farming and so on, but he had actually a very well thought out view of how that kind of economic activity would be tied to citizenship. Roosevelt's view was that living outdoors, working outdoors, would in fact produce kinds of character traits that would be valuable for citizens in general, but also in business and other kinds of pursuits. So part of my suggestion here is that agrarian views are actually quite fluid. Probably the most famous agrarian argument in the history of philosophy is in Hegel's philosophy of history. Hegel writes what I think to many people today would consider to be a kind of fantastic philosophy of history, in which he sees the rise of civilization starting with in Asia and Africa, but not really getting very far, and making gradual incremental advances as people start to develop the sense of themselves as a people and as a community, but really reaching its first important breakthrough point in ancient Greece. Why does it do this in ancient Greece? Why are the ancient Greeks the ones that develop a sense of citizenship and a sense of freedom and a sense of independence? And Hegel's answer is, well, it was because of their agriculture. The answer is that it was only in ancient Greece where you had a climate and soils that were conducive to relatively small-scale farms, steep hills, sandy soils, a climate that was conducive to tree and vine crops. Putting in those tree and vine crops made the Greeks who settled there and developed their agriculture very committed to maintaining their land. They had to stay there for years. They had to stay there over generations. Grapes and olive trees take decades to mature and be useful. And so the Greeks had a very strong attachment to defending their lands, but they also, because of the mountains and the hills, were not really conducive to the kinds of large-scale civilizations founded on slaves and essentially what we might call plantation-style agricultures that had existed in Egypt and in Asia. So, you had to have these relatively small-scale units, what we would today call family farms, in order to manage an agriculture like this. And you had to have people running that agriculture that had the decision-making ability and the capability to make those investments and then defend them. And what that created, according to Hegel, was a certain mentality which led itself to the formation of Greek city-states. Some of them quite democratic, others less democratic, but all of them with a very strong sense of citizenship and with a very strong sense that people who considered themselves to be free, independent citizens had a duty to act and to act on behalf of the community and to defend the community. Long story gets into how this leads into the unique Greek patterns of warfare, which were very successful and ultimately kind of led to their undoing as Alexander trots them off to conquer the rest of the world. So we actually get some of these arguments that suggest that place plays a very different kind of role in different kinds of circumstances. But one of the things that we see is that it's not just the sort of sitting here and appreciating the beauty. It's not a purely aesthetic or as effective kind of reaction to place. It's the practices of undertaking work at a place and investing oneself in a place that really promote these kinds of virtues in some of these agrarian ideals. So we get this idea that certain kinds of places combined with certain kinds of work practices have the capability of producing unique kinds of communities and unique kinds of values. Let's cut to food for a minute. Philosophers actually haven't written a lot about food. There are any number of places where food is used as an example in a philosophical treatise, but it's not been something that philosophers have thought a lot about. And so maybe the place to start is actually with anthropologists who actually have thought a lot about food. And one of my favorite anthropologists writing on food is Franz Fischler, who's a currently living, active French anthropologist, sociologist who has done quite a bit of work on food. And Fischler likes to suggest that when it comes to food, we need to recognize that we're in the realm of magical thinking. And what Fischler means by magical thinking is that symbolic, imagistic sorts of meanings and practices have results in the real world. Just like in magic. You combine something with an incantation, it has a result in the real world. Now, oftentimes the results that Fischler's noticing are things that are according to, that they work through a kind of social causality. But nonetheless, the kinds of ideas that people have about food have a kind of magical causality. We shouldn't think of this in the way that scientists typically think of causality. So here's a couple of examples. I mean, he's documented societies where people believe that eating lion will give you the characteristics of the lion. They'll make you lion-hearted. It'll make you courageous. And apparently this works, right? It apparently works for people who eat lion, become the most courageous and brave and hardiest people in the society. The idea here is that what you're eating, you take on the characteristics of what you're eating. Your identity is actually formed by what you eat. I mean, it's a literal reading of the old saying, you are what you eat, right? Another key application of this is that if you have a group of people who all eat the same thing, which we've all just done, then they become a community, right? Because the fact that they have all partaken of the same food becomes a basis on which they are all part of the same, they're all of the same body. Magical thinking, remember, magical thinking. But this idea that eating the same thing can be a source of community is one of the important claims that Fischler makes. Fischler's also done some interesting work surveying people in different parts of the world. He has a chart of pictures, and I cannot cite the details of this work, but what he does is he takes these pictures and he'll ask people to questions about food, and then ask them to associate that with one of the images. And interesting result, when he's done this in France, the image that gets picked out most when he asks people, what do you associate with food, is a tree, right? When he asks this question in the United States, the image that gets picked out most is a gasoline pump. That's all Fischler says, right? He doesn't interpret this, right? So, we've all had this wonderful meal, much of which, we presume was produced right here, about as local a food as we can get. And have we communed with this place in some sort of way that gives us a kind of identity? Can we feel like we have some sense of being together as a group because we've all eaten the same food, grown in the same place? Is this the reason that we ought to be eating local food? Recently, as a matter of fact, as recently as yesterday, I was told this afternoon, the New York Times ran a op-ed criticizing local food. A little earlier, I had read a longer piece in The Economist also criticizing local food. Local food, I'm almost kind of assuming that we've got pro-local food out here tonight, that we don't have a lot of skepticism in this group. So I'm not going to make the case for local food, but I do want to kind of share you some of these rationales for why this idea that eating local is actually not the most ethical thing to do. And let me just highlight 2 points. One, this was stressed in the Economist article, is that there are actually a number of supposedly ethical goals that can't be pursued simultaneously. They're incompatible with one another. Fair trade would be a good example of something that's incompatible with local food. Fair trade basically is, we're purchasing food on terms that are fair from farmers in developing countries. Obviously, this food is coming from a long way away, So if we're going to be eating local food, we're going to be displacing fair food. The argument here is that these things are incompatible, so they can't both be ethical, right? You can't have ethical principles that contradict one another. The article in the Times yesterday was focused much more on an environmental argument, and I'm sure that there's something sound to this argument, focusing somewhat on the idea that there are many parts of the world where you have naturally fertile soils or relatively more fertile soils, and where you have plentiful rainfall, and that these are good places to grow things, and that if you have to expend energy either to fertilize the soil or to pump groundwater out of a deep aquifer, that it might not make quite so much sense to produce food simply because it would be local. Similarly, you can move food quite a long distance in a boat or in a railroad car and use up a lot less energy than when you move food around in pickup trucks. And so on a kind of energy budget basis, it actually turns out that, at least for many parts of the country, local food is at least questionable in terms of its environmental benefits. So what do we want to say about this philosophically? I'm going to see if I can pull these things together. This will be a miracle if I can. Well, I actually want to come back to this. I mean, this is a point that Albert was making yesterday in his talk, for some of you who heard this, that we have these ways of thinking about ethics that stress rights and outcomes. And I think that what's behind these criticisms of local food are very much motivated by this way of thinking. Food is seen as a means to produce a certain sort of outcome. It's seen as a means to promote, we want to eat and be healthy. That's one of the outcomes. But in these cases, we're focusing on respecting the rights of workers in developing countries, or perhaps improving the quality of their lives. It's seen as a means to producing a certain sort of environmental quality. And to the extent that we're seeing food as a means for producing something else that is ethically valuable, then some of these local food arguments may not square up quite as nicely as they have. But what I also want to suggest is that that's exactly what fits with this gas pump metaphor. If you're seeing food as a gas pump, you're thinking of yourself as getting fueled up, right? Food is just a means to get the energy that you need for your body to function. And these other kinds of values that I was kind of alluding to with the agrarian ideals seem to be out of that picture. So what can we say on behalf of local food that's more in the spirit of this notion that we're trying to produce virtuous people, right? We're trying to be virtuous. We're trying to be communities. We want to fit together. We want to be a community. What can we say more that fits in this agrarian mode? And I think there are probably at least 4 things that we can say. The first is I spend a lot of time I'm a philosopher, but I'm also in an ag economics department. I tell my friends that when I'm on an airplane and I'm in a mood to be talkative and want to talk to people, I tell them I'm a philosopher, and when I want to be left alone, I tell them I'm an agricultural economist. The standard wrap around ag economics has been that the only thing that Americans care about with food is price and appearance. So if you produce a tomato that's bright red and doesn't have any blotches on it and is cheap, people are going to buy it. And they don't care about what it tastes like, they don't care about its cooking characteristics, and they sure don't care whether it was produced as local. So do this for me. The one thing that you can do when you buy local is that you can prove all those economists that they're wrong, right? You can show that there are other values that are relevant to the food system other than just price and appearance, and that narrowing in on getting food as cheap and as pretty as we can is not the only thing that's important in the food system. So that's my first thing that you're accomplishing. Second, I think that eating and buying local is a form of political speech. I mean, in one sense, maybe this is the same port over and over again, but it's a way of communicating to political leaders the things that you care about, and that you care about your local communities, and that you care about the places that you live. And it's also a way of showing solidarity with others in your community, and in particular with the farmers that are growing that food. So I think as a form of political speech, eating local really counters some of these concerns about its environmental and fair trade benefits. Secondly, I think that, and this may, or thirdly, what I think that eating local does is it actually gets you into a mode of thinking about what you're eating, right? You're not just pulling up to the pump. I mean, maybe there are some people that have long deliberative thoughts before they pull up to the pump. Albert, I can imagine that you have long deliberative thoughts before you pull up to the pump. But, you know, for me, I just pull up to the pump and I put my card in and I, pump my gas. It's not something that I engage in very much, right? So as you start to think about, looking for things that are local, trying to eat things that are in season, you start to develop a practice. You start to develop something that is a potential source of meaning and engagement and practice within your life. And so I think this is something that many people, at least, will find rewarding and will be conducive to developing some of these further character traits of conscientiousness, engagement, thinking, moving away from a strictly consumerist sort of attitude. And food is a great place to focus on for those kinds of characteristics. And then finally, and this maybe at least returns us back to both the agrarianism of this farm and this place, when you're eating locally and you're doing that with other people, I think you are building communities. I think that you're doing things with other people. There are activities that you can engage in. Everybody has a slightly different role. I prefer the role of eating. Actually, I like cooking, and I'll even clean up occasionally too. But you come up with reciprocities and mutual activities, and yet they're all engaged around this idea of eating. And so it becomes a way of, I think, developing not just a personal virtue, but a kind of community virtue. And hopefully we've done a little bit of that here tonight. So I'd be happy to take any kind of questions or comments or enthusiasms or criticisms. Yeah, in the back.
Well, one of the things that you said about eating locally is forming a community. I mean, I also think that eating something, we have a community with the entire world, and I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with eating something from Chile and having a community there as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I'm trying to say, I could use this kind of language, that we really shouldn't think of eating locally as a moral duty, right? When we kind of haul out this language of moral duty to talk about things that you would be a bad person if you didn't eat locally, right? If you ate something from Chile or where else, and that's the wrong kind of language to use, right? Trying foods from different parts of the world, for that matter, occasionally going in and having a Big Mac, right? I'm not going to hold this against anybody. I don't think these are things that we really need to haul out this language of duties or think that we're violating somebody's rights or that we're doing things that are kind of like really, that we're violating fundamental moral principles. But, the other side of this is that we need some moral principles and some moral guidance that will really give us positive things to do. And I think that we can combine, drinking fair trade coffee. You're probably not producing a lot of coffee here in the valley with eating local food, and it makes perfect sense. I think those are, you don't even have to be a genius to keep those contradictory ideas in mind at the same time. Yeah.
But I think there is a different dimension to this problem. Like, I come from a country, India, Like, we don't get the best of prawns there, or the best of Hillshire, the fish we eat, or the best of the mangoes, because it's all exported outside. So if the developed countries eat food locally, then maybe the
Maybe
developing...
you'd get some good stuff too.
Yeah, that's exactly. I eat best of prawns because I'm in United States of America. Otherwise, when I'm back in India, I eat little shrimps.
Yeah. So, point taken. Yeah.
May I contribute reason number 5?
Okay.
It seems to me, actually, what I would regard as a very strong reason that eating locally develops community is that insofar as a relatively small community is self-sufficient, that is, feeds itself, it is not subject to the vagaries of the market, over which it has little or probably, more likely, no control. And it seems to me that kind of good independence is something that that potentially is a very tight knitter of people.
Yeah, I think certainly one of the themes that has been part of agrarian thought all along is that a notion of self-reliance is really part of what agrarian values produce. And I think one of the things that it's actually a notion that I want to endorse, but I also want to caution at the same time, because it's the kind of notion that can flip over into kind of xenophobia pretty easily. So self-reliance, independence from the market, yes, but let's have that, let's have that occasional meal from Chile or wherever, yeah.
So what do you do in the winter when it's all snow?
Well, we have great technical solutions to this, right? In Michigan, we have this wonderful technology called hoop houses. And we actually get, fresh vegetables all year round in Michigan now. And if we can do it in Michigan. I mean, let me back up and say, I think that that this is a when we're talking about eating local, and we're actually generally talking about duties of diet broadly, we ought not to be too literal, and we ought to give ourselves a few breaks. I'm saying these are important values, they're valid values. I'm arguing with The Economist and the New York Times, but I'm also not going to go quite so far as to say that these have to be things that you adhere to with a kind of religious devotion that you might many moral principles.
Another point is, being a minority, it seems kind of funny coming, America, we can get anything. You guys want to go to a sort of primitive state where you're going locally, and for other people, we want to be able to have access to them.
Yeah, you want to be able to sell some, right? I mean, I think...
Or just, like living here, I'd like to have some tropical fruits that I probably couldn't grow here.
Right. Right. One of the things that I think can be useful in terms of thinking about the way in which food can pull us into a community is that, there are a number of different kinds of communities. One of my favorite philosophers, not that widely read these days, is a philosopher named Josiah Royce. And Royce argued that there are basically two kinds of communities. And Royce's distinction was many communities are communities of memory. They're basically people who have shared memories. Literally maybe have been at the same place, have grown up in the same places, remember the same kinds of places. But Royce was fearful that communities of memory tend to be exclusionary communities, because if you don't have that memory, then you can't be part of the community. And what he suggested was that a better model of community is the community of hope, where what pulls people together is a shared vision into the future. And I think we can incorporate those sorts of ideas into thinking about eating both locally and internationally. And to the extent that we're thinking about the community that we're trying to build as a community of hope, as opposed to a community that draws boundaries and excludes, we wind up with a more positive, a more fruitful notion of community. Yes. I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Oh, sorry. Yes, the question inevitably comes to what does it mean to be local? And what's setting up the boundaries of what's local, what's not local. I guess a lot of people have the idea of local to be influenced by regionalism.
Right.
Like a certain watershed, and certain, and then of course that puts more emphasis on the river, the aquifer. We've got enough emphasis on
Right.
what is actually water use.
So I think that there are a number of legitimate ways to go about the whole notion of eating local, and I think one of the things that has driven this real focus on how far can we go, right? So my wife at home is currently involved in organizing Eat Local Week back in Lansing, Michigan, and one of our big problems was salt. Where are we going to get salt? And it turns out that they actually produce salt in Windsor, Canada. Right, which is less than 100 miles away. And so we drove to Canada and bought 3 or 4 bags of Windsor salt for Eat Local Week in Michigan. And, we're kind of in the spirit of this and so on. And I was just afraid of, what was going to happen if they decided to go through my car at the border and how I was going to explain how I had all these bags of salt in my car and what they were going to think it really was. Fortunately, we didn't get stopped. But so I think part of what is behind those thoughts is this sort of environmental ideal, and it's certainly something to bear in mind. I think one of the things that's good about these programs is that they put this in front of you. They make you think about it, and thinking about it is a good thing. But ultimately, I think probably a more functional ideal for thinking about what's local is this notion of a community of hope. What kind of aspirations do we have? And we are an extremely interconnected world, and we probably don't want to develop communities that are truly isolated. And if the point of eating local starts to become taken so literally that we start to exclude ourselves from others and from, different cultures and different food experiences, then I think we've moved away from this notion of a community of hope. And, again, I'm going to come back to this idea. We're not so much doing this to accomplish certain environmental ends, or this is not a strict moral duty. These are virtues. These are things that are supposed to enliven and engage us and make us feel better about ourselves. They're the sorts of things that we would like to pass on to future generations. And the test is not whether or not we meet some sort of hard and fast requirement, but the extent to which this enlivens us and gives us a sense of community and a sense of forward-lookingness. So the answer that I would give is that, at a certain point in those deliberations, it probably becomes important to back away from, trying to work out the detailed carbon balance of how far you can move food and so on, and actually recognize that reaching out and having a sense of community that might, it might be concentrated in a particular region, but for certain foods and things that would be hard to get, and commodities that can be grown very efficiently in some parts of the world but maybe not here, that you wouldn't really quite enforce this notion quite so strictly. Yeah.
I have a question. It seems like what you're talking about is focused mostly on agriculture, but I'm wondering if it could be expanded to look at other forms of like fruit collection, such as hunting, like deer hunting or something like that. Would you say that that's included, or would that sort of be a separate?
Well, I would say that it should be included, and it should be something that could at least potentially be part of the discussion. I think, again, it's going to depend on how a community starts to envision itself looking into the future. Certainly, deriving when people in the past have used the phrase agrarianism or thought about agrarianism, they've thought about deriving the subsistence, and it has included hunting and it's included fishing and Emerson in particular is a philosopher who wrote about this, and always lists the farmer, the fisherman, and so on in terms of his list. So I wouldn't exclude it on principle, and I think that it's probably going to be one of those things that's going to make sense one way in one community and in one place, and might make a very different kind of sense in a different place. Yeah.
I like your notion of eating locally as a way to build communities, and I hadn't really thought about that with regards to eating locally before. And I also know that one reason to eat locally is to simply get better tasting, fresher food.
Right.
And maybe know more about the place where it came from. But other than those two main reasons, my initial impression of the idea of eating locally was that it was a way of addressing negative externalities, environmental damage that wasn't getting factored into the price that we pay for food at the supermarket. Speaking as an economist,
Right.
Would you agree that other than the issues of building community and having more choice and better options for the consumer, would you say that those two issues aside, that if economic policies were such that negative externalities, environmental damages were factored into the price of goods, in this case specifically food, then the environmental economic argument for eating locally would be moot?
Well, I think that it's going to prove to be the case that there are going to be some commodities that it does make sense to produce and move around. Wheat is probably a good example. There are some parts of the world where it's great to produce wheat, and others where it doesn't grow very well, and it's not that expensive to move in bulk. Hauling it around in small vehicles would have huge environmental costs. So to the extent that we could get more effective pricing in the grocery store for some of the environmental costs of production, we'd probably find that we'd be eating certain things locally more than we are now, but there would be other things that would hardly change at all. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Would that be virtuous?
Huh?
Would that kind of system be virtuous?
I think that part of what I think is really valuable about local food is really defeated when you're just going to the supermarket and picking it off the shelf just because it happens to be the cheapest and the one that's in closest reach. So, I think that some of the kinds of strictly economic adjustments that might be made that would promote more local production and more local consumption the arguments for that are kind of weak from my point of view, that they don't really promote some of these virtues. My thinking is that what's really been good about local food is that people are thinking about food, and it's not a matter of achieving an objective, right? Let's make sure all the food in Walmart is locally produced, and then we don't have to think about it anymore. What's been good about this is that we're thinking about food, and that it's becoming something that is, for many people, something that is a focus of their thought, is something that they talk to one another about, that they're able to actually engage in activities with one another. They're able to invite one another over for small meals or large meals like this one. These are the things that are really good about local food. And I think that some of in some respects, some of the rationales that have been produced in connection with local food, you know, it's not that I'm obviously not against the environment, but I actually think those are, you know, I don't care if the New York Times and the Economist are right about that. That's not what I think is really most important. Yeah.
Maybe you're just using it as a metaphor, but with the rate of obesity today, wouldn't it be better if they were engaging in exercise?
You know, I mean, I'm no one to talk about obesity, right? You know, I think, you know, obviously there are a lot of things that people can do that are going to be, are going to build character both individually and communally. And, you know, eating is a good example because everybody does it. And it's something that, you know, people at all stages of life can participate in, and people in all types of physical condition can participate in together. You know, a good vigorous volleyball game may be better for you, but you know, there are going to be certain people that are just unable to participate in that. That's not actually a remark against volleyball or exercise, because we have time in our lives for a lot of these activities, right? But there are reasons, I think, to pick out food and eating and growing food, you know, pulling this into the whole cycle, as particularly important and particularly significant areas where we might want to look to creating some of these kinds of activities.
Oh, you have time for one more question.
Okay. Who wants to be last? Okay.
What do you see as the barriers for a community to kind of get the whole community thinking about mindfully, and sort of maybe some ideas for overcoming those?
Well, you know, I do think that at a certain point, you know, this has to be something that that people want to engage in, and we probably need to recognize that in many of our communities, there are going to be some people that are really not interested in it, and so I'm not even sure that I would pick, you know, getting the whole community involved as a targeted goal. Right? The idea is to build a sense of community and to be inclusive in your vision of what that community is, and to try to think creatively about ways that would pull people into the community, but in a kind of honest way, so that they're really part of the, you know, they really are part of the community. And I think that you know, the kinds of things that are done routinely are the right sorts of things. You know, festivals where, you know, people go down and, you know, hear music and, you know, eat lots of local food. You know, those are good things. And even if somebody only does that once a year, it's going to give them a certain tie to the broader community. I actually think that the main barriers are, I mean, we are ourselves the main barriers. These are things to do that require energy. They require commitment. They require time. You know, it's amazing the amount of effort that it takes to get a farmer's market up and running and to continue running. You constantly have to be recruiting new farmers, and, you know, you constantly have to be trying to make things easier, you know, for people to get in and out. And you have to constantly be trying to figure out ways to make it accessible to people that, you know, may you know, have trouble getting around, or, you know, there are just a million problems to be solved. And we have to not let ourselves be overcome by that. And I think that, you know, there are things that we could do at a policy level that would improve this, but frankly, I don't think that it's so much a matter of barriers as it is. I mean, I would love to see a farm bill, for example, where we took a lot of the money out of commodity supports and put it into community development for food systems. Right? That would be a real positive. But can I say that the fact that we don't have that is a barrier? Well, I'm not sure it is. Right? I mean, we could probably, if people, you know, would put the energy into it, we could do a lot of this ourselves and on a volunteer basis. So I think it's, you know, it's, and to some respects, we probably feel better about ourselves if we did it that way. So let me close on that. Thank you for your attention.